KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to the Hearsay Culture Network and another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon Law as well as an affiliate scholar at Stanford Law Center for Internet and Society, also affiliated with the University of North Carolina Center for Information Technology and Public Life and the University of Milan's Information Society Law Center. Today, we are celebrating the career on Hearsay Culture of one of the leading advocates on access to medicine in the United States in the last quarter century at least, Professor Brook Baker of Northeastern University. I've known Brook for a number of years because we are usually, maybe always, but certainly usually on the same side of issues involving access to medicine. My focus being in trade secrecy in particular, but Brook is being far broader than that. So that's both a disclaimer and a caveat. However, beyond that, Brook is well known throughout the advocacy community, the public health community, the access to medicine community, not only nationally and internationally, for his work on universal access to treatment, prevention, and care of individuals ranging from HIV/AIDS to most recently COVID-19. Brook is retiring from full-time teaching after a lengthy and illustrious career. And in fact, there will be a celebration of his career at Northeastern University on June 10th, which when this show airs on KZSU is just a few days away, but one that I will certainly be attending via Zoom. Can't be there in person to talk about his career and his contributions as well as his reflections on his career. Brook is someone who brings so much to the table because, again, not only is he a scholar in this space, but he's also an advocate. And there aren't a lot of professors who do the kinds of work in the advocacy space that Brook does, and even more unusually on an international level. And so the conversation today is going to be quite broad. We're going to focus, of course, on access to medicine and where things stand globally on access to treatment and vaccines and some of the legal and political challenges around it. But then roughly in the last third of the discussion, because it is a privilege to speak to someone with the experience that Brook has, I want to talk a bit about teaching today and Brook's reflections on his career and law schools and some of the challenges that we're facing in education going forward. Brook, as mentioned, is a professor of law at Northeastern University, teaches disability discrimination law, which is also, though we haven't spent much time on it, is a mutual area of expertise and negotiation. He's taught and consulted in South African law schools and law school clinics from 1997 to 2012. He's an honorary research fellow at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, South Africa. He is consulted by and consults with virtually every international organization around access to medicine, from the African Union to various UN organizations. He works very closely with the Open Society Institute, with Public Citizen and other groups like that. And I could go on and on, which I'm not going to do here because Brook is joining us via Zoom. And so let's jump right in. Brook, thank you so much for joining me today on Hearsay Culture.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me, and I really appreciate this opportunity to connect with your audience.
So, Brook, let's start big picture, and it's kind of a fundamental question that people ask and immediately hear, which is, what is access to medicine? So when we use that phrase, we're not talking about necessarily being able to go to a doctor. It's something, I think, although that's part of it, much broader and more fundamental. So how do we define that idea?
Well, one of the great advances of science and to some extent even traditional societies, the discoveries they made about certain treatments that are beneficial to maintaining or recovering health. When we get sick, which all of us will at some point, and some of us desperately so, and some of us facing death literally without access to these what we call medicines. Um, we access to medicines is really involved with the entire spectrum of, well, how do we come up with medicines? How do we invent them? How do we discover them? How do we test them to make sure they're safe and efficacious? How do we get them approved for entry into market? How are they priced? Who controls distribution? What is the kind of clinical guidance which informs medical providers on prescribing the medicines and then patients being appropriately informed so that they can make rational use of the medicines that they need. It's really a very broad spectrum, but the fundamental idea is for many human health conditions, thankfully, there are medicines which help people regain or maintain health. And when we are sick or when we have medical conditions that medicines are good for, all of us, everyone in the world has an interest in having access to those medicines, that they be accessible and affordable to them, and that they receive proper instruction on how to use them and what to look out for in terms of side effects and interactions with other drugs. So the issue I work on, access to medicine, is despite that common need, which all of us have as humans, medicines are not equally distributed in the world. They're not equally distributed in the United States, and they're even less equally distributed globally. And the idea that there are people who are just like you and me, people with health needs, who do not have the privilege of access to medicines, whereas as a university law professor, I have tremendous access to medicines, and my entire family. I don't have a family member who would be alive today without access to medicine. All of them have faced life-threatening conditions where it was only access to medicine that saved their lives. And so we have this common human need, but we live in a world of grossly inequitable access. And there's many explanations for that, but certainly one of them is the power that drug companies have, pharmaceutical companies have, to control supply, price, and distribution, and the fact that our governments really don't use the measures that they could to ensure that medicines are available equitably.
So when you talk about this, Brook, and we think about it in the United States, I think most people listening in the United States, because of our healthcare system, think of cost, right? The problem, the issue of access to medicine involves cost. But on a global scale, it's much more than just that. And so can you frame that for the listeners when we talk about the challenges of access to medicine globally, right? What more than price plays a big role?
Well, I want to focus on the company control a little bit, because it is more than price, right? Because companies can make a decision whether they're going to enter a market at all. The place that companies will first market their medicines and typically charge high prices are the US and Europe. And US first, because drug companies charge the highest prices in the US and make the vast proportion of their extraordinary profits off of the US market. Secondarily, Europe, and then Japan and Australia and Canada and a few other rich countries. And they will delay their market entry or even neglect to enter markets where people are poor and what can't pay the prices that they want. So in many instances, they delay seeking marketing approval. For example, Moderna never bothered to get marketing approval for its messenger RNA vaccine, even in a relatively rich country like South Africa. It just it kind of wasn't worth it. It wanted to sell its initial stocks of messenger RNA vaccines into the US and Europe. And that's what it did. That's what it focused on. And that's how it made tens of billions of dollars during the COVID pandemic. So I just want to, so the companies, because they have what we call exclusive rights, okay, which are both patents and in your area of expertise, trade secrets, and know-how to produce complex medicines as well, they get to exclude competitors because they have these exclusive right monopolies and exclusive right trade secrets. And because they can exclude competitors, they can pretty much decide how much they're going to produce, what they're going to sell for, and who they're going to distribute to, and
Mhm.
who's going to be given priority. And so, we have to think of this very big industry, $1 trillion industry, and the footprint it has on access to medicine before we also address all the other issues. Now, and you're right, there are lots of other issues.
Right.
Does the government prioritize buying medicines for its population? If
Mhm.
not, do people have enough income to pay out-of-pocket prices? And in many parts of the world, people don't have money to pay out of pocket for medicines, even cheap medicines. A
Mhm.
medicine that costs $1 for someone making $1 a day is too much sometimes,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And it has to be subsidized and paid for in other ways. You have to have health systems that are capable of giving quality health services. Um, Now we know even the U.S. we have some places that we could say are medical deserts. I mean, some places it's hard to get to a pharmacy. Some places it's hard to get to a doctor or
Mhm.
another health provider for a particular condition. People in rural communities, but also in states that now we're certainly seeing in the abortion context, we're seeing, deserts in terms
Right.
of access to those kinds of health services. Well, globally, that's true too, particularly in poor countries and particularly for rural populations as opposed to urban populations where hospitals anyway tend to be centered in the urban setting. Um, Another feature of it is, and this is critically important and probably a human rights perspective that we don't talk about quite as much, and we may come back to later in the discussion, is
Mhm.
people have a right to health related information so
Mhm.
they can make smart
Mhm.
choices that they know what they need, how to use it, what its benefits are, what its side effects are, what to look out for, um, how it interacts with other things. And that basic right of information is also information that's supposed to be provided by the companies that sell the products, accurate information, and also by governments.
Mhm.
All right.
Mhm.
And so, people won't know to ask for medicine if they don't have any information about it. They won't know about getting tested unless they know if they have a condition that there's a medicine available. They won't know that they have to adhere to their treatment and finish the course of treatment or take
Mhm.
a pill every day for the rest of their lives.
Mhm.
Um, and so all of those things go into what we call access to medicine. The supply chain,
Now,
the
before we actually right there on the supply chain, let me jump in because that's I want to ask you the kind of contextual question now, which is, the medicine for the most part, right? At least in the modern era, is created by private companies, right? And those private companies are operating, generally speaking, as we know, in a market-driven system. But let's make it simple: they're looking to make profits, right? And if they don't make profits, they're either not going to produce medicines, which is the likely outcome, or the argument would go they're going to produce medicines that aren't effective, that don't get the job done. So at one level, what you're describing as a moral concern is really unassailable for any people of goodwill. But the challenge, and this is what I'm asking about, right? The challenge is more complex. So it's easy to say, let's make medicines accessible. But where are those regulatory and legal hurdles built into the system? To put it differently, what would pharma say as far as access to medicine and the challenges that exist?
Well, that's a great question, and I think there's a couple ways to think about it. One at the innovation side, right? At the finding using scientific inquiry to know a disease target, to identify a compound or biologic product that might affect that bodily function in a positive way, right? That's basic science. And most of that is publicly funded in the United States.
Mhm.
Actually, globally, it's mostly publicly funded.
Mhm.
It's the highest risk and highest return area of research, right? It's what National Institutes of Health pays Stanford probably tens of millions, maybe more
Right.
a year for that kind of research, and many
Mhm.
other, between 30 and $40 billion a year out from NIH to universities in the United States and actually some universities elsewhere. Um, when a lead, let's call it a lead compound, a promising
Mhm.
medicine is invented or discovered, then there have to be further product development to optimize it, and then test it in humans to make sure it's safe and effective, and to invest in what's called good manufacturing practice to ensure built-in quality. Um, that tends to be partially subsidized, again, by the public upfront, but more commonly paid out of the coffers of drug companies, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
the basic system right now is there's a university inventor. He or she's got a bunch of PhD students and postdocs toiling away. They come up with
Mhm.
something, they get a spinoff. They start investigating a little bit further. Venture capitalists come in and give them some more money and want a big piece of the pie. And then big pharma swoops in and buys the promising product or invention,
Mhm.
and then they take it through clinical trials and put it on the market. When they buy the scientist's discovery, right? They also buy the exclusivities, the patent rights that the inventor has already filed for and usually gotten. The universities often get them, or the individual inventor and their team may get it.
Mhm.
Um, and that gives them a right to exclude competition. And the theory that pharma would say is, well, we need profits from sales to incentivize future innovation. If we don't have more money coming in, more than simply the cost of production, or even to recover our past R&D costs, we will not have the money we need to invest in new inventions, right? So
Mhm.
that's what pharma says. Now, when you look at what pharma actually does with its money, um, it makes what we would call super profits. It charges prices for medicines that are often 1,000 times the cost of production.
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
literally 1,000 times the cost of production.
That's so. Just to be clear, you're saying, if a dollar, if it costs $1, they're charging $1,000.
Right. So the
Yeah.
the
Okay.
the
Just say.
the
I mean
protein.
the numbers. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
at a
I'm not
thousand.
great with numbers, but I think I got
Yeah.
that one. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Well, and one of the best cases of that was the hepatitis C medicine, where
Mhm.
literally it was $1,000 a pill. You
Mhm.
needed 84 pills to cure yourself from hepatitis C, and that's what Gilead charged.
Mhm.
And
Right.
the cost
Right.
of production was you know
Yeah.
was was a fraction, was 1,000.
Mhm.
Now, uh, so obviously and they sold a lot of it, and they made
Mhm.
billions and billions of dollars a year on the
Mhm.
sale of that product, and still do. Um, well, do they invest all of that extra money that they earn in R&D? Well, the answer is no. They actually invest it mainly in stock buybacks and compensation to senior executives who get paid through because of increases in stock value, and stock buybacks give that back. So it's a super profitable industry where some of the money goes back into R&D, R&D that piggybacks on what the public sector has already paid for in terms of what I talked about previously, the subsidized, uh, basic scientific research. Um, and they do invest some of that, but much greater percentage is actually in the stock buybacks and executive compensation, in advertising,
Mhm.
and to some extent an overhead. So um, the system overcompensates at this point. The system of having these
Mhm.
exclusive right overcompensates for the research and development that we need, right?
So let me ask you this, Brooke, because this is where you've used a phrase there, which I could hear some listeners raising alarm bells. Overcompensate. And so let me ask you let's frame it this way. And I want to use COVID as an example, right? I think you and I agree, and most people agree that regardless of anything else, it is remarkable how quickly that vaccine was developed, right? At least one that effective that quickly. And I can imagine a listener saying, "Look, Professor Baker, right? I'm willing to pay a premium for getting a vaccine that quickly." And so if the pharmaceutical companies want to paint their pockets with cash, That's just the price we pay for having a vaccine that's developed that quickly. In other words, right, I'm making this very transactional. It's a transaction. And as a member of the public, right, I'm not talking about, again, I want to be clear, I'm talking about the public as opposed to, which we're going to come back to, places where it's so unaffordable and not accessible and not available that people are dying the hundreds of thousands, which of course also happened during COVID. But for those in countries where this development is happening, I can imagine them saying in a transactional way, well, you know what? That's the price for having a vaccine that saves my life. And so therefore, this overcompensation idea is really you, Professor Baker, and others, right? Telling people how much money they should make. How do
Well,
you respond?
I respond this way. It, the, First of all, I want to agree with what you first said. There
Mhm,
was incredible, much more open science,
mhm,
much faster pace, much more systemic cooperation in the early phases of the pandemic to
mhm,
get that to make science work and
mhm.
produce these new
Well, okay. Do you think therefore I overstated the contributions that pharma in particular made in this space?
Well, a lot of the basic science that they relied on, for example, had previously been subsidized
Okay.
by National Institutes of Health
Hmm.
to the tune of a couple $10 billion. I mean, no,
Hmm.
18 billion if I remember, in
Hmm.
basic vaccine research
Right.
prior to COVID era that was relevant to the COVID vaccines that were developed.
Right.
Um, and in a way, there's a part of what you just said, which I think is correct, which is when you are first in line and you can afford to pay, the system works pretty well for you.
Hmm.
And when we say you can afford to pay, what happens in the US is for those of us fortunate enough to be insured, an insurance company pays. A big portion of the insurance premium is paid by our employer. It would be in our pocket otherwise, but it's paid by the employer, and we pay in COVID context nothing, or in other situations co-pays, which are relatively affordable, and we don't really even think about the cost. But the actual cost is quite high. COVID is a perfect example of a broader principle, which is yes, we were first in line, me especially. I was an older person, and
Right.
I was near the front of the line to get a vaccination myself, right?
Yep.
Um, and and I got them. In fact, I've had 5 COVID shots.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, but if you're in the other 80% of the world, other than the rich countries, right? And even some of the smaller rich countries had to wait. Um, you were waiting in line to die. And literally millions of people died unnecessarily because there weren't vaccines. Now,
Hmm.
is your rational consumer in the US should they still be happy because they were first in line?
Hmm.
Let's say your rational
Hmm.
but selfish
Hmm.
consumer.
Right. Right.
Well, it turns out no, because when people were untreated, and especially people who had weak immune systems were untreated, COVID could mutate in their bodies because it stayed in there a long time, and they weren't vaccinated, and they weren't they were neither vaccinated to prevent or vaccinated in a sense that treated COVID. And so we had all the waves of mutations that are still potentially going to plague us, but certainly plagued us over a 3.5 year period, right?
Hmm.
Uh, and it came back to kick people in the seat of the pants. Now, was it smart to allow the drug companies to artificially restrict supply, uh, jack up prices that rich people could pay, and
Hmm.
preferentially only serve markets in the US and in Europe when COVID ran rampant all over the rest of the world and came back to haunt us, over and over
Right.
again?
Right.
And that's a pandemic is a perfect an infectious pandemic like this one. It's a
Hmm.
perfect case of a broader principle, which is that in general terms, all of us are better off economically, socially, and otherwise when people are healthy.
Hmm.
The health of everyone actually is better for me. Everyone's health, everyone being healthy is better for me as even as a, you know, thinking of myself as a single, unit, in the US.
Hmm.
The world's a better place when people are healthy. It's why people call health a global public good, right? It's just good. Better health is better for everyone, without exception, you know.
We're
And
chatting with, oh, I'm sorry, we're chatting with Professor Brook Baker on Hearsay Culture and the Hearsay Culture Network on KZSU-FM Stanford. Brooke, go ahead. Yep.
so in a way, this idea of health solidarity is just also, you know, makes good sense in terms of self-interest
Hmm.
and good sense in terms of national interest. And so you can't say the system worked well when it failed the 80%, right?
Yep.
You have
Hmm.
to say, well, is that really great?
Hmm.
Or is it good enough?
Hmm.
Okay. Yes, I got in line first and I was able to pay. But lots of people in the US died, including from new variants that developed because people were untreated.
And
In
so
fact,
no, exactly. And I want to get to the politics of this in a moment, but you were quoted in an AP News article a short while ago with regard to South Africa and Colombia and others that are moving towards self-reliance, and particularly focusing on how less wealthy countries are attempting, as a result of the conditions you're describing, to become more self-reliant, after realizing, particularly after COVID, that they could not rely on the wealthier countries for their own public health. What does being self-reliant look like
okay.
in the developing world? What frame that for us?
Okay. Well, right. Just to build on the bedrock of what you
Yeah.
said before,
Mhm.
big pharma failed them, and rich countries hoarded medicines, hoarded vaccines, and actually the Paxlovid and the other antivirals as well. We got Canada bought 5 times as many vaccines as it needed for its population, just
Mhm.
for example, and then
Mhm.
it's just burned millions and millions of doses that
Right.
ultimately expired. Um, so um, so that neither the companies nor rich governments of the global north really expressed to the degree needed solidarity with the 80% of the people who live in what we call the developing world or low and middle income countries.
Mhm.
Um, and so can they take steps on their own to be better prepared and better able to respond to the health needs of their populations, despite the
Mhm.
monopolies of companies and the indifference of the global north? Well,
And I want to be clear about something. So global North and global South are, I think, terms of art within the community. You just
right.
make it. Are you talking about literally the equator?
I'm
Just
talking
to be clear,
about,
or yeah.
80% of the world's population lives in what are called low and middle income countries.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Right.
Where
Right.
so
Right.
for the low income are below $1,000 per person per year.
Mhm.
Middle income countries are below, I think, 13 or $14,000 per
Right. Right.
person per
Right.
year.
So when
So
we use the phrase global North, global South, it means what exactly?
it basically means that the rich countries
Yeah.
which have the industries that have can afford things that not that there aren't pockets of poverty and gross
Mhm.
inequality even in rich countries, but
Mhm.
but basically their governments are more likely, or they're more likely to be insured so that people can get at least some of the health services they need.
Mhm.
We'll come back to how
And
underserved the
I'm going to be
U.S. is.
really no, I'm going to be really pedantic here, but I want to be clear. So when we refer to North and South, what are we referring to specifically?
Well, people think, the big countries in the north, the US,
Right.
Canada,
Right.
all of Europe, right?
Mhm.
Japan, right?
Mhm.
There are a few Southern Hemisphere richer countries,
Right.
Australia,
Right.
New Zealand, but
Mhm.
the bulk of the rich countries in the world are in the Northern Hemisphere, and the
Right. Yeah. And,
bulk of
and and the reson why I push on it, just for clarity, and I'll go back to the question, is because the geography does correlate in this way, which makes it the metaphor. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Continue.
so So there are two different things that the countries can and should be doing, and should be doing more of,
Mhm.
both of which have some promising signs. One is, even though there was an international agreement which provided for intellectual property monopolies on a global basis called the World Trade Organization TRIPS Agreement, trade-related intellectual property rights. It's harmonized and a baseline of IP protections for patents, for copyrights, for trade secrets, et cetera. They have some flexibilities. They allow countries to act in their own behalf to allow competition when needed for public health needs. And many countries have not taken advantage of passing legislation to maximize their use of flexibilities, nor have they mustered the political will to use those flexibilities in their law. And some more and more countries are recognizing they need to do some law reform within the existing intellectual property regime to allow them to get access to more affordable medicines and larger supplies, and from companies that will actually prioritize them instead of just prioritizing the richest people in the world.
Mhm.
That's one strategy, right? Which is, to some extent work within the system, but use the flexibilities that countries are smart enough to build into it at the beginning. And just to let you know, the US used more of these flexibilities during COVID than any other country. It had contractual provisions that safeguarded Pfizer and all the big drug companies from patent infringement claims when they produced the medicines and vaccines that the US bought.
Mhm.
They
And
would
when we
get
talk and when we talk about flexibilities, what we're really saying is the ability to change what are generally very strict intellectual property laws and create exceptions to their enforcement for reasons like public health.
right, and
Yeah, yeah.
allow competition. So in
Hmm.
this case, Pfizer, it kind of reverse example, but if we were to use, Pfizer's an example, whether or not it had a particular contract or not,
Hmm.
um, it could not be sued by some of the component manufacturers who might have had patents of their own, right?
Hmm.
That Pfizer product or manufacturing processes may have violated. In fact, we know there are multiple patent challenges, infringement claims between companies right now. They're being litigated all around the world, right? They're all
Right.
claiming a bigger piece of the pie because it was such a big pie. But the US said, no, we want suppliers to supply us. We don't want you to worry about intellectual property, patent rights. If someone sues you, we'll foot the bill. The US
Hmm.
government will foot the bill.
Hmm.
Well, this is called a government use license. Okay. It's a form of compulsory licensing. So the US uses it, right? But many countries have not adopted provisions. And even though the US says it's against use of compulsory license, it used more of them than any other country in the world during COVID. Many countries
And
will
by
not.
compulsory licensing, we mean, as it sounds, right, more or less forcing companies to license or share their intellectual property.
Right. So
Yeah.
if you were a subcomponent manufacturer for the Pfizer vaccine and the hypothetical I'm using, you
Hmm.
couldn't sue Pfizer to stop them. You couldn't get an
Right.
injunction against them. You couldn't even
Hmm.
bring a claim against them for money.
Hmm.
Would have had to go to the US government instead. So there are flexibilities that countries can use to allow expanded competition, to allow local or regional production of medicines. So that's one thing. A related effort is to really become more self-reliant in terms of doing scientific research,
Hmm.
developing products, having local manufacturers who can produce at sufficient quantities and with good manufacturing practices to produce safe and effective medicines. And really to say, we're not going to wait in line for big pharma. We're not going to wait in line for donations and hand-me-downs from rich countries like happened with COVID. We're going to have our own capacity to innovate and to develop, manufacture and distribute locally. And so
Hmm.
we're going to basically become more self-reliant. And it's actually on one level, there's a lot of support for this idea of regional manufacturing. Even rich countries are to some extent in favor of it because they were to some extent shamed by, and certainly shamed in public opinion, excuse me, from what happened with COVID.
Mhm.
But what are they not willing to give up on at this point? The intellectual property rights.
Yeah.
They're saying it has to be on voluntary terms, and technology transfer has to be on voluntary terms.
Mhm.
And that's both with respect to the local manufacturing initiatives that are underway, and that's also true, as you know, there are the international negotiations right now at the World Health Organization,
Right.
because the world needs a new treaty to deal with future pandemics, because another one's going to come that could
Right.
be much worse than COVID in terms of the virulence of the disease. And are we going to have drug companies, big pharma, call the shots again next time about who gets medicines and who doesn't, and who
Yeah.
gets them early and who gets them late? And people are thinking, no, that doesn't make any sense. Well, regrettably, the U.S. and Europe did not learn the lesson of having variants come and kick them in the pants. They're still protecting big pharma because they're still thinking about first in line, first served, able to pay benefits, right?
And this is where, we're chatting with Professor Brook Baker on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture, which is a nonprofit Stanford, KZSU, and non-commercial radio station that requires donations in order to continue its diverse programming. So please reach out to us at donate@kzsu.stanford.edu. These issues seem intractable, and yet the law, which perhaps I think I'm going to put aside for today and maybe do a separate show on it, Brooke, since you might have more time, given retirement, to get into the weeds of intellectual property. But I want to pivot because that is, and again, as I mentioned in the introduction, you and I have worked together on some of these issues over the last multiple years, is where the challenge is in the law. But I want to pivot for a moment because you alluded to it broadly in public health and public perception. And I want to play for you and get your reaction to an answer to a question that Bill Gates, who I'm sure most people are familiar with, but who's also of the Gates Foundation, answered in response to a question from a Bloomberg reporter at the Davos conference in January. He was asked about concerns with regard to public health. He was asked particularly about understanding challenges associated with public health and misinformation in the context of questions about whether and how and why people would take vaccines. And so what I want to do here is play for you this particular clip from this interview and share it with my listeners, and then get your reaction to it. So this is Bill Gates at Davos in January of 2024.
Well, the misinformation about vaccines and associating certain people like myself or Fauci having malign intent with vaccines, that was most acute in the United States. But the pandemic, which you would have thought, wow, global health research to talking about health, being ready for the next pandemic, when you've got millions of deaths, isn't that, it's sad, it's tragic, but isn't at least there a benefit that health is on the agenda? Sadly, it's a topic nobody wants to talk about because it was painful, it's over, let's move on from that. And even the idea of, okay, the importance of WHO, the importance of vaccine research, and telling people, hey, vaccines really are very well tested, that's a question. Historically, when we've had vaccine hesitancy, for example, in Nigeria in 2001, the polio campaign faced disaster when some politicians said that oral polio vaccine was sterilizing Muslim women. And it took us 5 years working with the religious leaders where they would visibly vaccinate their children and talk about where the vaccine came and how it avoided children being paralyzed or dying. And we were able to get rid of polio from Nigeria. We have 2 countries left, Afghanistan and Pakistan, where we've never gotten to zero. It's spread back to Africa, so we have to also clean that up. But the hardest part that we're very close on, with a little bit of luck in a few years, we should be able to get to zero, is Pakistan and Afghanistan.
So is Bill Gates right that, and you just alluded to it, that these issues are off the agenda, and moreover, that there is a lack of interest among policymakers to even delve into these issues?
Well, have people basically begun to think of COVID as being in the rear mirror? Yes, right? Virtually everyone, except some public health, very knowledgeable public health people who keep looking at the data, right? And are worried about, the next mutation, and how much more transmissible it is and how much more deadly it might be, right? And whether our existing vaccines will be effective against this, mutated spike protein on COVID. And he's also right in a sense that one might have thought that with COVID-19, it would be a lesson from which it would be an example from which we would draw durable lessons, and we would plan for the future much more effectively than we're presently doing. So I agree with that. I would challenge that it's not, what do we call, use a term which I should probably explain. This understanding is socially constructed. This is because we didn't have other voices really emphasizing it, from government, from industry, from the private, from civil society, emphasizing there are lessons we have to learn from this. This is still a risk. It's a risk for COVID, and it's a risk for a different coronavirus, and it's a risk for influenza. It's a risk for mpox. We live in a world where it's increasingly likely that pandemic diseases can arise, and we are relying on the status quo of what didn't work that well last time as our baseline of response. And rich countries are fighting to preserve the prerogatives of the biopharmaceutical industry to control supply, price, and distribution. Now, and people should have been, much more, anyone who has a public voice should have been emphasizing much more. There are lessons we must learn, many, many lessons, right? Many detailed lessons. Now, the other thing that he talked about, and which I agree with and disagree with in some ways, is he talked about the misinformation and the disinformation that arose. And I spoke earlier in the interview about the idea of health literacy, that people have a right to accurate information. And it has to come from multiple sources and multiple directions, right? It needs to come from inside churches and synagogues and mosques, as well as from public health scientists and university scientists, et cetera, and from, even from members of the public. And if we all were to be better educated about the scientific information, right, the scientific process, about health, about how about how the body works and how disease works, what medicines are good for and what they're not good for, because they're not good for everything. Some things are overhyped, but and in other words, if we had the information that enabled us to pursue our own health and to be partners in health, right? So we would know, it would be generalized knowledge. Well, we have to be able to diagnose a disease. So you have to get tested. You have to get tested. My wife has the sniffles this morning, so she took a COVID test because we still have some, and it would be bad if she had COVID, and she would want to get vaccinated. We have to know that for an infectious disease, that getting tested early is important, and getting treated is important, and that there are treatments available. and how to finish your treatment, not to stop after 3 pills when you're supposed to take 5,
Right.
or not to skip doses if you're supposed to take them every week or, every day. And so there's so much that goes, that in terms of empowering people to be owners of their own health, to be participants in their own health. And therefore, and people who have that kind of information, that sense of self-efficacy, I don't think fall into the denialist camp and the vaccine skeptics.
So I
let
do.
me just point out one other idea.
Of course, go ahead. Yeah.
Which is he was also right and wrong that there wasn't vaccine disinformation in other areas of the world. There was. But one thing he didn't mention is there was also resignation because of not getting access to the medicines and the vaccines quickly. At some point, people simply gave up on the hope of vaccines, because if you were in a low-income country, they weren't there. And they certainly weren't in your village, and they may not have been in the nearest city. And if you know something's available and you're not getting it, at some point you say, screw this, right?
Right.
And there was some of that as well. So, there was some truth in what Gates had to say, but I think some gaps in what he had to say as well.
Well, and of course, the Gates Foundation, because of Gates and the money behind it, as you alluded to earlier, has, some outsized influence, which is another topic which we don't have time to dive into too much, except to say that it goes back to where the voices are and really who's being listened to, which is a gigantic challenge that civil society groups and more or less most academics have in this space. I want to pivot, Brook, in the last 12 or 13 minutes to your retirement. You've been in the field in academic teaching for about 25 years. You have extensive experience. I want to ask you this question. We're recording on May 28th, 2024. Gigantic changes are happening in the academic world, primarily being the advent of generative AI. As you look back on the last 25 odd years of teaching, what do you look back on as the most rewarding experiences that you have, considering that you've done clinical work, you've done teaching throughout the globe, not to mention all the stuff that we've talked about here, as you reflect on it as a professor?
Well, it's actually been closer to 45 years of teaching, but
That long. Okay.
25 years as an access to medicine.
I'm glad you corrected me. So prior to the last 25 years, talk a little bit about that background.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I started off as what was called a skills teacher. I directed a first-year skills program that focuses on research, writing, and advocacy. Was different from a lot of what a lot of schools are doing, because it was based on major simulations. So it was really a very rich context. And also, just to tell you a little bit about Northeastern is a very unusual law school because it has something called co-op, where during their upper level, the last 2 years of law school, students alternate full-time work periods with full-time law study periods. So our students have a lot more exposure to working with lawyers, doing the things that lawyers do as part of their legal training.
And by the way, just to note for listeners, I teach at Elon, where Luke Bierman is our former dean, who came from Northeastern and also was heavily involved in the experiential ed stuff there. So there is that overlap as well.
That's right. And so I taught the skills program. And when I first went to South Africa in 1997, when I had my first sabbatical, that's what I focused on was the skills component and working in the law clinic in South Africa. Because, I think most students want to be excellent lawyers. Some of them will be someone will be professors, someone will, head up NGOs, et cetera. But most of them will be lawyers. And I wanted to prepare them with the skills that they would actually need to be on co-op first, but but then also to enter their careers, but also to have a perspective on their careers, to have what I would call a critical and self-reflective perspective, both on their own lawyering, but also on the legal profession and the legal system that we have inherited and can change to some extent. And it's, as people may have discerned from what I've said already, I have a lot of criticism about the global order and about the way things go in this country. I think there's way too much inequality. I think there's way too much corporate power, and that we really need to seize the rights of people to have more say over essential products like health products or green technologies or educational resources, et cetera. Anyway, and so I was very focused on skills. And when I was in South Africa, they had a very formalistic legal system where it was really, you're supposed to pretty much memorize what it is the professor has to say, and then remind the professor what he said when there's an exam, right? And the idea of actually struggling with a novel legal fact pattern or real fact pattern and applying law that was uncertain and malleable was a challenge and a new idea. I was there for 6 months with my family, and had a great time at what was then the University of Durban, Westville, and then went back again the next year for a much shorter visit. And in the interim, they had done what was called anonymous HIV testing in the student body, and 27% of the female students were HIV positive, and 14% of the male students. And it was much higher in the Black African student population than the Indian diaspora student population. The school was about 50-50. And so, I looked out of the classroom and none of my students there, I didn't know who was HIV positive, but I knew, these are people who still, many of whom would become positive afterwards. I mean, the life expectancy of my class was essentially that 50% of them would have their lives end early because of HIV. And so we, I mentioned earlier, health challenges in my family. My younger son is a cancer survivor, a pediatric cancer survivor. He narrowly missed exposure to HIV infected blood for transfusion because they came up with a test for blood supply just 6 months before he was being treated. And so when I thought about, compared my experience teaching a classroom of students who are, for all intents and purposes, just like my students in Boston, and that, a quarter of them were already infected and many more would become infected, and then none of them had access to medicines for what was then a treatable condition, because in 1997, we really discovered the effectiveness of triple therapy for HIV. It was just unsupportable. I couldn't not become an AIDS activist, essentially, in those circumstances. And I knew I had never studied intellectual property. I had never studied public health, but I set myself on a crash course, and I worked with activists. And you alluded to this early when you described my career. And I'd say the first part of my career, I was very school focused, Northeastern focused, and student focused, and very much on capacitating students to become good lawyers and thoughtful and progressive lawyers. And my exposure to HIV really turned me into a globalist again, and really much more of an activist. And I chose not to focus mainly on writing, though I have written 50 articles.
I have to say, Brooke, you haven't focused on writing? My God, then I don't think any of us have, or certainly,
But I focus much more on working with the social movement. And the HIV story is an incredible one. When I was in South Africa, The cost of AIDS medicine was basically $10,000 per person per year, the same as it was in Boston.
Yeah.
And at that time,
Mhm.
there were probably 20 million people living with HIV in all of sub-Saharan Africa, and about 20,000 of the economic and political elite were on treatment. So
Mhm.
that meant, untold millions, not on treatment and likely to die
Right.
within 8 years. So what the AIDS movement did is it focused on trying to reduce the cost of medicines by by finding and getting generic products. And they got Indian companies to do so. First company was Cipla. And instead of 10,000, it
Mhm.
offered a price to MSF of 350. Well, now that in even
Doctors Without
better
Borders.
Doctors Without Borders,
Yeah, yeah.
even with better first line regimens now, the triple therapy for HIV costs $45 per person per year
Yeah.
to the vast
Yeah.
majority of people in sub-Saharan Africa.
Mhm.
And that same medicine, just by the way, is about $45,000 in the US, over
Mhm.
40,000 in the US. Okay. And guess how many people we have in treatment now? 20 million.
Wow.
Well,
Wow.
you said you weren't necessarily great on math, but I'll tell you this.
Yeah.
The price fell 1,000-fold and the
Yeah.
number of people increased 1,000-fold.
Yeah.
Now, I don't
Yeah.
think you have to be much of a mathematician to understand that affordability is crucial. Now, lots of other things happen too. You got funding sources. You got the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief. You had the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. You had an entire social movement of activists, people living with HIV and their allies who fought for health service delivery and who fought for testing and fought for early treatment and fought for quality of care. And there's still, there's almost 30 million people on treatment now. There's another 9 million or so that still need to be on treatment until we get a cure or until we get a vaccine that's really sterilizing vaccine. We're going to have to keep doing that. And it took a long time. I mean, millions of people died, unnecessarily, including friends of mine and colleagues from South Africa. I mean, by lots. Okay.
Mhm.
we can use the lessons that were learned over the 20 years of the AIDS access to treatment movement for other health conditions and for health more broadly. We should have learned those and applied those lessons in COVID. And so I know you asked me about my career as a teacher,
Yeah.
but I teach this now
Yeah.
in my courses. I teach a negotiation course. So we do a negotiation between a major drug company and the medicine patent pool to get the companies to agree to allow generic producers. And
Mhm.
the students have to, negotiate an agreement about that.
Yeah.
And, I teach a course on human rights, intellectual property, and access to medicines. And I used to teach a global HIV policy course. And we struggled over all these ideas about how much you need to know, how many things you have to pay attention to, how many systems of disadvantage and marginalization have to be addressed. HIV, again, a perfect
Mhm.
example where, there are key populations that historically are despised and so criminalized in some countries. Men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs,
Mhm.
sex workers, people who have higher vulnerability to HIV, and for whom special services and attention needs to be given. And we had to address the power of pharmaceutical companies, and we had to get resources, and we had to address systems. We had to get the WHO to work differently. So I want my students and future law students to understand you can have an impact in the world if you ally yourself with social movements, not because you're a leader, not because you're better than anyone else, but because you have skills that can help along the way. Um, if you think big, and you really want to, think very strategically over a long period of time about what to do, that's a career that you can also have as a lawyer, or even in unrelated areas of practice. You can still think about trying to make the systemic changes
Right.
that will advance the public good.
Professor Brook Breaker of Northeastern, congratulations on your retirement, and look forward to still seeing you in this community. And thank you for joining us today on Hearsay Culture.
Thank you very much.